The Andromeda Collective had spent approximately 14,000 years perfecting what they called civilized society. This achievement involved elaborate philosophical treatises, countless diplomatic summits, and the systematic removal of anything remotely resembling conflict from daily life. They had cultivated 17 different species into a harmonious coalition where the most violent act anyone could recall was an unfortunate incident involving a Palaxian diplomat who had sneezed too loudly during a treaty signing. The reverberations, apparently, had caused a decorative vase to fall. There were counseling sessions, reparations were paid. Into this delicate ecosystem of bubble-wrapped existence, humanity had recently been admitted. Not welcomed, mind you. Admitted. The way one might admit a wolverine into a petting zoo after it had somehow passed the entrance exam through what could only be described as a clerical error of cosmic proportions. The Collective's Educational Institute for Advanced Species Integration, or as the humans called it, with their characteristic disrespect for proper nomenclature, Space College, occupied a massive orbital platform above the neutral world of Praxis 7. The architecture reflected the Collective's aesthetic philosophy, all flowing curves and bioluminescent panels designed to soothe the senses and promote contemplative learning. There were meditation gardens that simulated 17 different planetary environments, cafeterias that could synthesize food for 300 different metabolic systems, and absolutely zero sharp corners anywhere because someone might get hurt. The humans had arrived 6 months ago, and the administration was still processing the insurance claims. It wasn't that humans were intentionally destructive. They simply existed at a different frequency than everyone else. Where other species saw a maintenance ladder, humans saw a climbing challenge. Where others recognized a caution, slippery when exposed to moisture sign, humans wondered what would happen if they ran across it wearing socks. The concept of unnecessary risk was, to them, a contradiction in terms. All risk was necessary, apparently, for something they called fun, or character building, or seeing what happens. The xenobiology department had published 3 papers in as many months trying to explain human behavior. The leading theory involved Earth's classification as a Class 12 Deathworld, a designation previously thought to be theoretical. Turned out, planets where literally everything was trying to kill you produced species with certain peculiarities. Redundant organs, excessive pain tolerance, threat assessment speeds measured in milliseconds rather than the more civilized minutes or hours. And most disturbingly, a complete inability to recognize when they should be afraid. Professor Zelthon, a Vetharian with skin like polished obsidian and 6 eyes that could process information across multiple spectrums, stood at the front of Applied Physics 301, gesturing at a holographic display. His lecture today covered kinetic energy transfer and impact dynamics. The irony of this would not become apparent for another 7 minutes. As you can observe, Zelthon explained, his voice carrying the melodic quality his species was known for. When 2 objects collide, the energy must be distributed according to fundamental principles. Mass, velocity, and structural integrity all factor into the outcome. The classroom contained 47 students representing 19 different species. Most took notes through their respective preferred methods, neural interfaces, holographic styluses, or in the case of the Clitherii student, interpretive color changes across their gelatinous surface. In the 3rd row, between a crystalline shard speaker and a floating Erythian gas cloud, sat Kira Chen, one of the 12 humans currently enrolled at the Institute. Kira had her actual physical notebook out, writing with an actual physical pen, because apparently humans still did things the ancient way, sometimes. She'd explained once that the motor memory helped her retain information. The other species found this fascinatingly primitive, like watching someone start a fire with sticks when fusion reactors existed. She was, by human standards, unremarkable. Average height for her species at about 5.5 feet, dark hair pulled back practically, the kind of build that came from Earth's punishing gravity rather than deliberate athletic training. By galactic standards, she was a walking nightmare of contained lethality. Her bones were dense enough to be classified as a composite material. Her muscle tissue could generate force that would tear apart most species' limbs. And her reaction time, that beautiful, terrifying gift from millions of years of predator and prey evolution, operated at speeds that made other species' defensive systems look like they were running on outdated software. She didn't look dangerous. That was the thing. None of the humans did. They looked soft and squishy, with their vulnerable skin and their bizarrely forward-facing eyes and their single heart that could just stop if you hit it wrong. Other species had armor or redundant systems, or the ability to regenerate. Humans had audacity and the kind of pattern recognition that could predict your next 3 moves before you'd finished making your first. 7 rows back and 3 seats over sat Krex Thor Vundal, and if the universe had a sense of humor, this is where it was showing. Krex Thor was Zentari, a species that had joined the collective roughly 3,000 years ago after their homeworld sun had started showing signs of instability. The collective had relocated them, provided resources, and integrated them into civilized society. In return, the Zentarii had spent 3 millennia developing a superiority complex that would have impressed ancient Earth's most arrogant empires. Zentari were tall, averaging 7 feet, with elongated limbs and a chitinous exoskeleton that gleamed in shades of blue and green. They were strong by collective standards, which meant they could lift approximately 60 pounds without mechanical assistance. Their homeworld had been low gravity, with a carefully balanced ecosystem, producing a species that was, in objective terms, kind of delicate. But they'd been apex predators in their environment, and they'd never quite let go of that identity, even though their environment had been roughly as dangerous as a moderately aggressive garden. Krex Thor exemplified his species' worst tendencies. He was in his 3rd year at the Institute, studying something related to resource distribution that he clearly didn't care about, coasting on family connections and the implicit bias that favored older collective species over newer additions. He'd developed a pattern over the past 2 years of what he probably thought was dominance behavior. Humans would have called it bullying, though that term didn't quite translate in collective standard. The Zentarii phrase meant something like establishing appropriate hierarchical relationships. He targeted smaller species, mostly. The Pipkin students with their mouse-like features and nervous dispositions. The occasional Thrin who made the mistake of sitting too close. Nothing overt enough to trigger official intervention, just a pattern of casual intimidation. A limb stretched out to trip someone. Books knocked off desks. The kind of small cruelties that added up over time, but individually seemed too minor to address in a society that prided itself on conflict avoidance. Kira had been attending the Institute for exactly 5 months and 17 days. She'd kept her head down mostly, focused on her coursework, tried to adapt to the peculiar social dynamics of a place where everyone was terrified of actual confrontation. She'd watched Krex Thor's behavior with the kind of cold assessment humans specialized in, cataloging patterns, noting escalations, waiting to see if anyone would actually do something about it. No one had, because doing something would require acknowledging that bad behavior existed, which would disrupt the carefully maintained fiction that the collective had evolved beyond such things. Professor Zelthon continued his lecture, manipulating the hologram to show various collision scenarios. Note how the distribution of force changes with different structural compositions. A rigid object transfers energy differently than one with flexibility built into its design. Kira was actually paying attention, pen moving across paper, because this was genuinely interesting. Physics operated the same everywhere in the universe, and there was something satisfying about seeing the mathematical proofs play out in visual form. She'd come to the Institute specifically for this. The chance to study under professors who understood principles she'd only read about in Earth's still developing understanding of galactic science. Behind her, 3 rows back, Krex Thor was bored. Boredom, for him, usually meant finding entertainment at someone else's expense. His eyes, multifaceted and glittering, scanned the classroom for opportunities. They settled on the human. The humans were still novelty items at the Institute, equal parts curiosity and concern. They'd passed the entrance requirements, which should have been impossible given their species' relative technological level. Earth had only achieved faster-than-light travel 20 years ago through a combination of brilliant engineering and what the collective called an alarming disregard for safety protocols. Humans called it innovation. The collective was still investigating whether those were actually different things. But passing entrance requirements didn't mean acceptance, not socially. The other species didn't know what to make of humans yet. The official xenobiology reports were terrifying, full of words like persistence predator and endurance hunter, and can continue functioning with catastrophic injuries that would kill most species. But the humans themselves seemed friendly enough, enthusiastic even. They smiled a lot, which was unsettling because they showed their teeth when they did it, and teeth meant different things across species. But they seemed to mean it positively. Krex Thor had decided, in his infinite wisdom, that the humans were bluffing, that the reports were exaggerated, that something that soft-looking couldn't possibly be as dangerous as claimed. This conclusion was based on absolutely nothing except his own prejudices and a sample size of exactly 0 actual interactions with humans in conflict situations. The scientific method would have had some notes about his reasoning. He stood, making it seem casual, like he was just stretching. His desk was the kind that accommodated various body types, adjustable and floating slightly above the floor. He moved into the aisle, ostensibly heading toward the front where students could get a better view of the holographic display. His trajectory took him directly past Kira's desk. Professor Zelthon was deep into explaining angular momentum, multiple limbs gesturing in complex patterns. The other students were focused on the lecture, or on their notes, or in the case of the Erythian, on maintaining cohesion in the classroom's atmospheric composition. No one was paying attention to Krex Thor. Except Kira, because humans had this unfortunate habit of tracking potential threats in their peripheral vision. Millions of years of evolution had wired them to notice when something large was moving toward them, with unclear intentions. She didn't turn her head, just kept writing. But her awareness had shifted. Threat assessment protocols, running in the background of her mind like automatic subroutines, updating constantly. Krex Thor reached her desk. And then, in a move he'd probably practiced to look accidental, he brought his arm forward and knocked her notebook clear off the desk. Papers scattered. Her pen skittered across the floor. The notebook itself hit the ground with a slap that echoed in the acoustically optimized chamber. "Oh," he said, his voice carrying false concern. "Apologies. How clumsy of me." 14 species in that classroom understood immediately that it wasn't an accident. But 14 species in that classroom had also been socialized in the collective's conflict avoidance culture. Eyes averted. Nobody said anything. This was the Zentarii's problem and the humans' problem, and getting involved would be improper. Kira looked down at her scattered notes. Then up at Krexthor, who was smirking with whatever his facial structure did that approximated smirking. Then back down at her notes. And here's where millions of years of evolution met 5 months of cultural immersion and exactly 0 patience for this particular brand of nonsense. She stood up. Not quickly, not aggressively. Just stood. Her movements had the kind of efficiency that came from growing up in 1G gravity, where wasted motion meant wasted energy. She bent down, collected her notebook and papers, set them back on her desk, found her pen. The whole process took maybe 10 seconds. Krexthor was still standing there, blocking the aisle, apparently expecting some kind of reaction. Maybe submission, maybe tears. Whatever he usually got from his targets. What he got instead was Kira turning to face him fully, and for the first time, he got a good look at human eyes up close. Forward-facing. Predator's eyes. Focused on him with the kind of attention usually reserved for prey items. Humans had this thing they did, this assessment look, where they calculated vectors and weak points and optimal force application, all in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Most species never noticed it, because most species never threatened humans. Krexthor noticed it now. "Move," Kira said. One word. Quiet, not a request. And Krexthor, who had spent 3 years establishing his hierarchical position, who had never been challenged by anyone smaller than him, who had the backing of 3,000 years of collective membership, made a choice. He put his hand on her shoulder and shoved. Not hard by his species standards, just enough to assert dominance, to put the upstart human in her place, to remind her that he was taller and stronger and more important. He might as well have poked a sleeping tiger with a stick. What happened next took approximately 2.5 seconds. To the other species in the room, it was a blur. To Kira, running on neurology that operated at combat speeds, it was almost slow motion. Her hand came up, caught his wrist. Her grip was casual, no visible effort. But Krexthor's exoskeleton immediately began developing stress fractures from the pressure. Before pain signals could even reach his brain, she'd pivoted using his own momentum and her lower center of gravity to execute a throw that would have been basic in any Earth martial art, but was completely outside the collective's understanding of physical conflict. Krexthor left his feet. This should have been impossible. He outweighed her by at least 40 pounds and had 7 feet of height. But mass and leverage were mathematical principles, and Earth's gravity had taught humans to weaponize physics in ways that the collective, with their peaceful civilization, had never needed to explore. He went up, over, and down. The classroom floor was designed to be soft, because safety. But it still made a satisfying thud when 230 pounds of Zentari hit it at velocity. His exoskeleton, beautiful and gleaming and utterly inadequate for this kind of impact, cracked audibly. Not shattered, but definitely compromised. His facial structure, delicate and evolved for a world where nothing ever hit you hard, compressed on impact. Chitinous plates shifted. Underlying tissue structures, vulnerable and squishy despite the outer shell, took the full force of a physics lesson in practical application. Kira released his wrist, stepped back, and returned to her desk. Sat down, picked up her pen. The entire motion was fluid, economical, practiced. She was breathing slightly elevated, but that was it. No visible strain, no triumph or anger on her face. Just a job completed and a return to the interrupted task. The classroom was silent, not the comfortable silence of students focused on learning. The horrified silence of witnesses who'd just seen their understanding of reality get body slammed into the ground. Professor Zelthon had stopped mid-lecture, all 6 eyes focused on the scene. His mouth, or the equivalent structure, hung open. The hologram continued playing, ironically showing a simulation of kinetic energy transfer, while the real-world demonstration lay groaning on the floor. Krexthor was making sounds. Not words, just sounds. The Zentarii equivalent of whimpering mixed with the clicking that indicated severe distress. His face, or what remained of its original configuration, was already swelling. Exoskeletal fractures leaked fluid that served functions similar to blood in other species. His limbs moved weakly, like someone trying to remember how bodies worked. The crystalline shard speaker 2 seats over from Kira let out a frequency that translated roughly to, "What in the infinite void was that?" The Erythian's gas cloud had contracted to about half its normal volume, in what might have been shock or might have been self-preservation instinct. The Palaxian in the front row was already typing furiously on a communication device, probably alerting medical services. Kira, for her part, was reviewing her notes, pen tapping against her notebook. When she spoke, her voice was level, conversational. "Professor, could you repeat that last part about angular momentum? I missed it during the interruption." Zelthon stared at her, then at Krexthor, then back at her. His species had evolved on a world where the most dangerous predator was roughly equivalent to an Earth rabbit. They had no framework for processing what he'd just witnessed. In collective terms, what had just occurred was roughly equivalent to a nuclear detonation in a meditation garden. Medical. There should be. Zelthon's melodic voice had lost all composure. He was cycling through several languages, none of them producing coherent sentences. The medical drones arrived 4 minutes later, alerted by the classroom's automated monitoring systems that had detected the biological distress signals. They were small, floating spheres equipped with diagnostic scanners and emergency treatment capabilities. They swarmed around Krexthor, beeping in concern, their sensors probably overloading trying to catalog the damage. One of them, displaying more initiative than its companions, floated over to Kira, scanned her, beeped in confusion, scanned again. Her elevated heart rate was already returning to baseline. No injuries detected, no stress hormones beyond the temporary spike from physical exertion. By every metric the drone could measure, she just had a light workout. The drone returned to its companions. There was actual communication between them, rapid-fire beeps and clicks. The translation matrix hovering near the ceiling updated. Subject displays multiple structural failures. Exoskeleton integrity compromised at 17 points. Facial structure requires reconstruction. Soft tissue damage extensive. Subject should not be moved without stabilization. How did this happen? Secondary subject shows no signs of combat engagement. This is inconsistent with observed results. Please advise. Campus security arrived next, 3 of them, wearing ceremonial armor that hadn't seen actual use in approximately 4,000 years. They looked at Krexthor, looked at Kira, looked at each other. The lead security officer, a Vetharian like the professor, approached carefully. "We need statements," he said, "from all witnesses, and from those involved in the incident." Kira set down her pen. "He knocked my materials off my desk. I asked him to move. He physically pushed me. I responded with appropriate defensive action." The way she said it, flat and factual, somehow made it worse. There was no anger, no justification, no attempt to minimize or exaggerate. Just a recitation of events, like reading a grocery list. The security officer's 6 eyes blinked in sequence. "Defensive action," he repeated, as if testing the words. "Yes." That resulted in He gestured vaguely at Krexthor, who the medical drones were now carefully loading onto an anti-grav stretcher. Structural damage, apparently, Kira said. I used minimal necessary force. He initiated physical contact. Earth law, which I believe is recognized under collective sovereignty agreements, permits proportional self-defense. Proportional, the officer repeated. Another test. Another word that apparently meant something different in practice than in theory. He pushed me. I removed him from my immediate proximity. The subsequent impact with the floor was a consequence of gravity and momentum, both of which, she gestured at the still-playing hologram, we were literally just learning about. One of the other security officers, a species that resembled a bipedal salamander, was reviewing footage from the classroom's recording systems. Standard practice, apparently, though the recordings were supposedly only for educational review and conflict resolution. He played it back, slowing down the footage. Even at reduced speed, Kira's movements were almost too fast to follow. Human combat reflexes operating at full capacity looked, to species with more leisurely neurology, like something from a science fiction thriller. The salamander officer made a whistling sound. She's not wrong. He initiated contact. Her response was immediate. Immediate, the lead officer said. Third repetition. He was really struggling here. The medical drones had stabilized Krexthor enough to transport. As they guided the stretcher toward the door, one of his eyes, the ones that weren't swollen shut, focused on Kira. There was something in that look. Not anger, not even hatred. Fear. Pure, primal, instinctive fear. The recognition that he'd made a categorical error about what humans were capable of. Kira met his gaze briefly, then returned to her notes. Dismissive. Not worth extended attention. In the complex social dynamics of predator and prey species, this was the ultimate insult. You weren't even interesting enough to monitor. The security officers collected statements from the other students. The accounts were remarkably consistent, probably because nobody wanted to lie and because the footage existed anyway. Yes, Krexthor had knocked over her materials. Yes, he'd pushed her. Yes, she'd responded by demonstrating that Earth's gravity well-bred different tolerances for force application. The Pipkin student who'd been one of Krexthor's previous targets was particularly detailed in her statement. She included dates and times of previous incidents, noting that this had been part of an established pattern of behavior. The security officers looked increasingly uncomfortable as the testimony continued. This was the kind of thing the collective wasn't supposed to have. Bullying required acknowledging that some individuals engaged in hostile behavior, which contradicted the foundational myth of civilized society. Professor Zelthon finally recovered enough composure to dismiss the class. Nobody argued. Students filed out quickly, most giving Kira a wide berth. Not hostile, exactly. Wary, like giving space to a predator who just demonstrated its capabilities. Kira packed her materials carefully, notebook and pen going into her bag. She was the last one out, because she wasn't going to rush. Rushing would imply concern, and she'd done nothing that required concern. By Earth standards, she'd shown remarkable restraint. By collective standards, she'd committed what was probably classified as aggravated assault. The next 72 hours were bureaucratic chaos. The Institute had protocols for conflict resolution. They involved mediation, counseling, restorative justice circles, and approximately 47 forms. What they didn't have was protocols for when the conflict resolution happened in 2.5 seconds before anyone could intervene. Kira was placed on temporary administrative leave while the incident was investigated. This meant she couldn't attend classes, but could remain on campus. She spent the time in the human quarters, catching up on reading, working out in the gravity-adjustable gym that had been installed specifically because humans needed the exercise, or they got weird. The other 11 humans at the Institute were supportive, in the way humans tended to be when one of their own was in trouble. They brought her food, shared their own stories of cultural adjustment, and offered to help if things escalated. One of them, Marcus, who was studying xenobiology, pulled up Krexthor's medical reports. 17 fracture points, he read. Facial reconstruction required. Soft tissue damage, they're calling it catastrophic structural failure. He pushed me, Kira said. What was I supposed to do? Let him push you, apparently, Marcus said. That's what they do here. Someone's aggressive, you just take it and report it through proper channels and wait 17 business days for a mediation session. That's insane. That's civilization, apparently. The investigation involved reviewing the footage approximately 600 times from multiple angles. Forensic analysts measured force vectors and impact dynamics. Xenobiologists were consulted to determine if Kira's response had been intentional violence or instinctive reaction. This question turned out to be complicated because humans had this unfortunate tendency to weaponize their instincts. The lead investigator, an ancient Thrin with experience in collective law, interviewed Kira personally. The Thrin were insectoid, with compound eyes and mandibles that clicked when they spoke. They'd been with the collective for over 8,000 years and had seen, supposedly, everything. Ms. Chen, the investigator began, using the human convention of surnames. Do you understand the severity of what occurred? Someone pushed me, and I stopped them from doing it again, Kira said. That seems pretty clear. You caused extensive injuries. I defended myself. Your defense was disproportionate to the threat. He outweighed me by 40 pounds and had 7 feet of height, Kira said. How is defending myself from someone with significant physical advantages disproportionate? The investigator clicked their mandibles, the Thrin equivalent of a frustrated sigh. In collective society, we resolve conflicts through communication and proper channels. Physical altercation is never acceptable. He made it physical first. Your response was more physical. My response was effective, Kira corrected. There's a difference. If I'd been ineffective, we'd be having this conversation about how I got hurt instead. You could have simply moved away. He was blocking my path. You could have called for assistance. And in the time it took for someone to arrive, what exactly was supposed to happen? I should just accept being pushed around because asking for help is more civilized. The investigator didn't have a good answer for that. The collective's entire conflict resolution system was predicated on everyone agreeing to wait for mediation. It functioned when both parties bought into the system. It completely collapsed when one party decided to bypass it entirely. The medical reports on Krexthor were detailed and, frankly, horrifying to species that didn't routinely experience physical trauma. His exoskeleton would heal, but it would take months. The facial reconstruction was progressing, but he'd have visible scarring, which for Zentarii was culturally significant. They judged attractiveness partially on exoskeleton smoothness. The psychological reports were somehow worse. He was experiencing what humans would recognize as post-traumatic stress, specifically related to the sudden realization that he wasn't the apex predator he'd thought he was. There were calls from various student groups. The Zentarii community wanted Kira expelled, obviously. The smaller species, the ones who'd been on the receiving end of Krexthor's behavior, were oddly silent, which spoke volumes. The human contingent submitted a formal brief pointing out that Kira had acted within Earth legal frameworks, that Earth was a sovereign member of the collective, and that imposing collective cultural standards on human defensive instincts was a violation of cultural autonomy agreements. The collective's legal scholars tied themselves in knots trying to figure out if there was precedent. There wasn't. Nobody had ever punched anyone before. Not in 14,000 years of recorded collective history. There had been accidents, equipment malfunctions, and one memorable incident with a runaway transport vehicle. But actual intentional physical conflict? Never. Until the humans arrived. On the fourth day, the decision came down. The Thrin investigator delivered it personally, mandibles clicking in what might have been resigned acceptance. After extensive review, they said, "We find that Miss Chen's actions, while shocking to collective sensibilities, do not violate Institute regulations. The footage clearly shows that physical contact was initiated by Krexthor Vundal. Ms. Chen's response, while severe in outcome, was defensive in nature and proportional to the perceived threat given her species' threat assessment neurology. No disciplinary action will be taken." Kira nodded. "Can I return to class?" "Yes, however." The investigator paused. "There will be changes, institute-wide." The changes rolled out over the following week. Mandatory seminars on Deathworld species, specifically humans. Educational materials covering human biology, reflexes, and the critical concept that humans couldn't actually turn off their threat responses just because they were in a civilized setting. New protocols for conflict resolution that acknowledged some species might defend themselves physically if threatened. And perhaps most significantly, an acknowledgement in official institute policy that civilized behavior might look different depending on evolutionary context. Krexthor returned to classes 3 weeks later. His exoskeleton bore visible repair marks. He walked differently, more carefully, like someone who'd learned that actions had consequences. When he saw Kira in the hallway, he didn't just avoid her. He left, turned around and took a different route entirely. The other students noticed. Word had spread, of course. Humans might look soft, but underneath they were compressed springs of violence waiting for the right trigger. Don't touch them. Don't threaten them. And definitely don't push them, because you'll learn more about physics than you ever wanted to know. Kira's reputation had shifted from curious newcomer to that human who hospitalized someone by accident. She maintained it was self-defense. Most everyone agreed with her, intellectually. But there was a wariness now. A recognition that humans were playing by different rules because they'd been forged in different fires. Professor Zelthon continued his applied physics lectures. When they reached the section on impact dynamics and force distribution, there was a noticeable tension in the room. He carefully avoided using the previous incident as an example, though everyone was thinking about it. Kira took notes diligently, pen on paper, learning the mathematical principles that explained exactly what had happened when Zentarii exoskeleton met classroom floor at velocity. The semester continued. Incidents of bullying at the Institute dropped to effectively 0. Turned out, when one species demonstrated that they'd respond immediately and effectively to physical intimidation, others got the message. The collective's conflict avoidance culture remained intact. But now, it had an interesting asterisk. Assuming no humans were involved. The Pipkin student who'd been targeted by Krexthor approached Kira one day in the cafeteria. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for what you did." "I just defended myself," Kira said. "I know. But after you did, he stopped bothering everyone else too." Kira considered this. "That wasn't really my intention." Sometimes intentions don't matter as much as results, which was, in its own way, a very human philosophy. 6 months later, when the Institute published its annual security report, there was a new section. Incidents of physical altercation now had its own category. The count for the year. 1. The resolution, justified self-defense. The recommendation, additional cultural awareness training for all students regarding species from high-gravity death worlds and their involuntary defensive responses. Kira graduated 3 years later with honors in astrophysics. Her thesis on gravitational wave propagation was considered groundbreaking. At the ceremony, when she walked across the stage, there was applause, enthusiastic even. The collective had learned to appreciate humans, or at least to appreciate that humans had valuable contributions to make, assuming you didn't physically threaten them. Krex Thor graduated the same year. Different department, different ceremony. His thesis was adequate, unremarkable. He developed a reputation for being exceptionally careful around other students, particularly smaller ones, and especially the humans. Some called it wisdom. Others called it fear. Both were probably correct. The Andromeda Collective continued its 14,000-year mission of perfecting civilized society. They still had their elaborate philosophical treatises and diplomatic summits. They still avoided conflict through extensive mediation and proper channels. But they'd learned an important lesson about the difference between eliminating conflict and simply suppressing it until someone from Earth showed up and demonstrated the logical consequences of pushing people who'd evolved to push back. The universe, it turned out, was more complicated than they'd thought. Civilization wasn't one thing but many things, shaped by the worlds that forged them. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most civilized response was the one that taught bullies that actions had immediate, physical, and undeniable consequences. The decorative vases were safe, though. The humans had learned to be careful around those.